It's me, Matt Dragonstone, your friendly local wizard. You may remember me from such promises as the one that I made last year, when I said that I would be putting out way more podcast episodes. And I just wanted to start off today with an apology that hasn't really happened. I think 4 episodes in a year, considering the kind of year that I've had, is quite good, but it's definitely not up to the level that I wanted. So sorry for the radio silence yet again. And, here's hoping that next year I can put out a few more episodes than just 4, and 2 of which, being guest appearances on other people's podcasts where they did all the editing, marketing, and distribution. So, 2025. I'm recording this at midday on New Year's Eve, 2025, and I thought I'd just quickly jump on, do a solo show, look back at the year that was, and then tentatively look forward to the year that will be coming our way with a vengeance, I would imagine, is the only way that we can talk about that. So, this year, what a year indeed, Jesus. But, lots of personal stuff happened for me. I got married in November. I took advantage of a fantastic election with a very strong Mars, a very strong Venus, a very strong Jupiter, a somewhat debilitated Saturn that I had tucked away in the 11th house, and the election was fantastic, the day was fantastic, and that was definitely the highlight of my year, to be able to finally marry the mother of my children, and it was a wonderful day had by all. Another thing that happened this year for me personally was that I graduated Christopher Warnock's Talismanic Magic course, Astrological Magic course. It's something that I've been doing for a very long time. I've been, of course, independently researching Talismanic Magic, but I felt I needed to have some sort of, I guess you'd call it formal qualification in the area, just to kind of bed down some professional practices, and I finally graduated that course at about the same time as my good friend Vanessa Arena, so that was 2025's other big achievement. A long time ago, Chris had up on his website that if you graduate the course, you get to use the title Astrologicus Magus, which is Latin for astrological magician. He's since taken that down, but when I enrolled, it was up there, and that was part of the allure, is yet another title, so I'm claiming that for my own. Sorry, Chris, but it was a good experience overall. So, got married, graduated a course, feeling fantastic. As I mentioned before, no podcast content to speak of this year. I'll definitely try harder next year. I have, however, written a book. I wanted to write a book this year, and I have written a book. It's with the publisher, or with the press, actually, at the moment. I'm publishing it myself, so it's with the printers. That's the word I was looking for. It's with the printers at the moment, and I'm just waiting on getting a proof copy to give it a final scan over, and I'm looking forward to launching that around the middle of January. The book is called Tarot for the Spiritual Seeker. It's a lovely, gentle, but comprehensive introduction to tarot within the context of spiritual practice, rather than predictive or prognostic approaches to the tarot per se. It's entirely self-published, typeset, written, designed, all of the elements done by yours truly, and I'll have that out soon. So if you're on the mailing list, look out for an email, and if not, join the mailing list, go to the website, and you'll be able to get first dibs, which is lovely. I have taught this year as well, but not workshops. I think workshops may be a 2026 thing. And, I've been teaching one-on-one. I've offered a new appointment type on my website, which is for the tutorials for tarot and astrology. And I have absolutely loved acquiring a bunch of new students that I'm working with individually to guide through the process of learning the technical aspects of tarot and astrology, and then also to see the ways in which that starts to, plant seeds of spiritual growth that slowly germinate, and I'm absolutely loving that. So plenty of spots left for tutorials. I'm not overwhelmed just yet, but if you're keen on learning tarot and astrology with myself, then check it out. Go to the website. I'll put some links in the show notes to make it easier for you. The talisman business has been really good this year, but hasn't really expanded to where I've wanted it to be. I've stuck within a kind of orthodox model of astrological magic that has served me well while I was completing Chris's course, but I want to kind of branch out a little bit, and I've been able to work with some other astrological magicians and talismanic magicians generally across the world in the past 12 months, and their approaches are really interesting. I'm speaking specifically about Reverend Janglebones and others, and their approaches have been great, and being able to collaborate with them to help with astrological timings for their work, and then also to kind of learn through cross-pollination their approach to acquiring things like materia that go into talismans, makes me really, really excited about what 2026 is all about. That being said, I'm not going to step away from the strict orthodoxy. I'm just going to add additional things to the talisman side of the business, which allows for a more holistic and importantly an experimental approach to talismanic magic. So there'll be two streams of offerings, put it that way. The good old-fashioned strict adherence to ancient texts, which I like to call that kind of preservation of the structure, and then the innovation and experimentation, which I actually feel like a lot of the authors of these texts, like the author of the Picatrix, and Agrippa, and the author of the Shams al-Marif, and other astrological and astromagical grimoires, probably would have been more into than just people completely copy and pasting their very particular approaches without necessarily investigating the deeper structure and trying to evolve that. So that's what I'm excited about for the talismanic business. So I'm just going to pause to cough. So that was me personally in 2025. Lots of stuff going on and lots of good plans for 2026. And I feel like in terms of commenting on the vibe shift that's going on, I'm going to start with a really interesting observation that I made just recently, which is I like to keep tabs through the social networks that I move through, some of which being heavily occult and esoteric, and some of which being quite mainstream, to see where certain cultural images, certain cultural artifacts kind of bubble up to the surface as interesting things to discuss. And one of the things that I've noticed recently is that Fight Club, the iconic movie from late 90s, 2000s with Brad Pitt and Edward Norton, has re-entered the cultural imaginary quite strongly in the past couple of weeks. And I've been thinking about what this means for where we're headed for the next calendar year into 2026. And I've been thinking about Fight Club in terms of what it represents. A lot of people see the movie and basically think angry young men belting the shit out of each other and generally causing havoc, and which is kind of true on the surface, but my read of it has always been that it speaks to a kind of dissatisfaction and frustration that tends to bubble over into a self-organizing maelstrom of activity where men predominantly, and that is something that I think will be slightly different about next year, is that it'll include men and women, but men predominantly kind of finding a way to craft a self-identity amidst a kind of decaying and morally corrupt society around them. You can read all sorts of stuff into it. I think a lot of people see Fight Club as a spiritual, a tale of spiritual awakening amid severe mental illness, which Ed Norton's character kind of goes through. But I also feel like that spiritual aspect's a bit overplayed. I feel like it's more about generating a kind of self-generating capital, a self-generating source of cultural capital that people just start to freestyle. And so I feel like that emergence into a lot of the conversations that I've been privy to amongst very disparate circles of friends recently kind of hints at the vibe for the next 12 months. I'm going to do an episode about Fight Club specifically, but I've just been thinking this morning about how we're kind of entering into a Fight Club scenario, which is small, mostly clandestine, or at the very least, difficult to surveil groups of men who are disenfranchised and frustrated, but seeking a sense of self-identity that isn't necessarily capitalistic, but maybe defines itself in opposition or antagonistically against the way that, late capitalism is presenting itself at the moment, which does tend to look a little bit like the world that Fight Club is kind of set in, which is interesting. So not much has changed in 20 years, except that late capitalism has become sort of roided up by the technology that sort of supports it. And I feel like in the next 12 months, a lot of that Fight Club mentality is just going to be part of the part of the kind of background vibe that a lot of the events of next year are going to present themselves as, or within. And I was thinking also about Neptune and Saturn and the conjunction in Aries and the massive pile-up in Aries in the middle of April next year, which does not fill me with joy or anticipation or excitement. And I've been thinking about what Saturn and Neptune together in Aries is going to look like, specifically as it relates to the industry that I've built a career in over the past couple of decades, and that I sort of work and rely a lot on, which is the wellness industry. Quite a few non-esoteric sources and non-sort of, wellness industry sources are predicting a massive contraction in the wellness industry next year, and I can see it kind of happening at the moment, where people are sort of waking up to some of the more, shall we say, Neptunian or Neptune in Pisces or Piscean aspects of wellness, which is take these psychedelics, trip out of this plane of existence and avoid all responsibility, which is cool. And I don't necessarily see there being a massive swing back to the kind of rigorous focus on self-discipline that characterizes some of the other periods in spiritual history. But what I have been thinking about is, how does Aries work in that environment? How does Neptune and Aries work? And how does Neptune and Saturn in Aries, because Saturn does not like being in Aries, it's far too fast for the old man and he gets a little bit grumpy, but how does that look for spirituality? How does that look for astrology? How does that look for tarot, magic, and all of the other aspects of the occult revival, which are about to become quite heavily pressure tested? And one of the answers that I've got is immediate benefits or get the fuck out. That's kind of what I'm imagining that kind of experience is going to kind of have to shape itself into in order to be perpetuated. When I think about Neptune in Aries or Saturn in Aries or both of them together, or Aries generally, I tend to think of, being 8 years old and having a 10-year-old older brother who is effectively there to just continually antagonize and challenge me. Not that I have a brother, but I've observed a lot of that with the kids that I grew up with, where there were, 2 or 3 boys in the household. I think that Aries is kind of that slightly older brother who has been there first, who knows how it works, and who wants to tell you how things go, kind of pressure testing everything that you come up with. Which, generally speaking, if you're a younger child and you're an imaginative, dreamy, kind of sensitive soul, that doesn't necessarily bode particularly well. But what it does do is it pushes you back onto enough of your own back foot to be able to spring back and push back against the tyranny of the slightly older brother. But, so that's kind of what I'm imagining Aries to be. And the Aries vibe next year gets turned up to 11. And if you're a nice kind of gentle hippie soul who's spent a good 16 or so years tripping balls and being soft and operating in a cultural landscape which is conducive to that, you're going to find next year to be quite abrupt, because you'll be immediately challenged to justify, I guess, the validity of your approach, if not justify your existence as a whole, depending on the context that you find yourself in. And that will be quite jarring and quite traumatic for a lot of people. It will probably cause a lot of people to abandon those aspects of their spiritual explorations that kind of, preferenced softness and preferenced sensibility. But for those who remain, and maybe even for those who enjoy having to kind of be a bit more dynamic and maybe even bombastic in their kind of proclamations of self, it's going to be quite exciting. Personally, I don't give a shit one way or the other. I'm very comfortable with who I am, and so, if there's going to be antagonism next year that's directed towards me and what I do and who I am, and by extension, a little bit my family, I'm totally okay to take on those battles, regardless of how they look. So I'm good, but I think that the bulk of people, the majority of people who have supported, broadly speaking, a wellness industry that has grown to be quite lucrative, albeit a heavily capitalized model, which is sort of what we've got to work with in the West. Those people are probably going to just move on and find something different. And that would probably involve working out. We'll start to see gyms becoming the new spiritual temples and lots of martial arts stuff, and that's fantastic. But as a result, I think the industry, as it currently stands, will probably contract significantly. And that need that people are addressing, and have been for quite some time in a very Neptune and Pisces way, is going to kind of have to shape itself into something different entirely. Personally, I've enjoyed the esoteric and occult revival. There's certainly a shit ton more content up on the internet and being published and, available than there ever was in the lead up to now, which is great. And I'll have more than enough content to be going on with for the rest of my lifetime. But, I think it's going to be a little bit more difficult for me to do this full time. So we'll have to see where we end up this time next year. That being said, I'm super, super chuffed. Aside from Saturn and Aries and that immediate benefits or get the fuck out kind of mentality, which sort of pushes everyone into a space where they have to demonstrate the validity of their spiritual beliefs, we've also got, I think, the way in which that vibe shift is going to present itself in a political sense, a geopolitical sense, and generally speaking in an interpersonal sense within society. And I feel like we do have war next year. We have at least the beginnings of quickly escalating conflicts. I think the big flashpoint for me is the middle of April. I'm just looking at what we've got sort of in the skies around 15, 16 April. We've got Mercury, Neptune, Mars, Moon, Saturn, Sun, and Chiron, all in Aries. It's definitely a big fucking impact on Australia, probably also a big impact on Great Britain if I've got the charts right, simply because Aries is our collective first house. But there's also, I guess, when we look at that amount of Aryan energy, it's a massive indicator of a societal shift that we haven't seen really since 2020. And in 2020, it was far more insidious and structural. It was far more almost predictable, really. When you look at the way in which, there was an anticipated response to a global pandemic, and that response just became far too hyperbolic in terms of the governmental structures restricting our ways of life. Hello, Capricorn. But when I'm looking at Aries, there's less structural stuff. There's more personal explosions of energy and violence. And that's the middle of April next year. Now, I'm not going to do a 2026 forecast. I don't really do that. I prefer 2026 to be something that one discovers on a personal level, and so therefore the personal year ahead forecasts are where I put my focus. I'll definitely be doing something with Lance like I do every year, just because I like Australian politics and I like doing really localized, mundane astrological forecasts, but that's about the extent to which I'll make any predictions for this coming year based on the general vibe, and I feel like April is not a happy time for anybody. So that's kind of where we're at next year. We're moving into a space where we have to start demonstrating worth, and everything has to be kind of battle ready. If it's not strong, if it's not resistant, if it's not so much able to be weaponized, but at least, kind of beaten into a shield shape, if not a spear shape, then we're not going to have time to maintain structures that aren't immediately beneficial. Luckily for me, like I said, tarot and astrology and magic have always been immediately beneficial. That's why they've survived so long. But I feel like a lot of people's belief systems that aren't focused on results or tangible benefits will have to fall by the wayside. And that's where a lot of that dissonance is. It's an interesting time. It's one that I think will come with more bloodshed and violence. I'm not 100% happy about that, for obvious reasons, but it is definitely one that we have to go through collectively. So much like 2025, 2026 is happening whether you like it or not, and I feel like it's something that we can kind of navigate together, and if we move our focus more so on, I guess, making a place for victory and loss rather than collective elevation, then that's just the way things have to be. Very interesting times indeed. So, every year I like to put on that note, every year I like to put out a personal thank you to everybody who's listened. So thank you very much for continuing to listen to the podcast. I love each and every one of you, and I'm looking forward to seeing together what 2026 will bring, and finding some pleasant surprises, and also, not necessarily being shocked by what happens. Interesting times indeed. Have a nice 2026 and Happy New Year. Ciao for now.